All right, I'm here with, I'm going to preface it. I'm going to preface your title with the. You've earned the for, I'm here with the Vicky Pillitteri from our good friends over at NIST. Hello, Vicky.
Hey, Andy. Thanks for having me back. Me and my cold.
And this is the second time that we're collaborating. Vicky's an alumnus of the Watchers podcast. It's another great production that Sentinel Blue puts on. But today what we're going to be doing is Vicky's a author on NIST's famous publication, infamous, you could argue in certain circles, Special Publication 800-171, particularly Rev 3, its current iteration. And the goal is we're going to dive into it a bit today, spend some time exploring it, and taking advantage of the fact that we have an author in front of us who can really speak to it and answer some of the common questions we have around it. Does that sound fair?
The interrogation begins.
Yes. So, yeah, why? Why have you done this? No. Let's start with just a quick recap of Rev 3 from Rev 2. There's some thematic changes from Rev 2 to Rev 3 that maybe you could summarize or speak to some of the big items.
Okay, so the first and foremost is, we got tired of Rev 2 and we thought it was time. So it was time to update from Rev 2 to Rev 3 because 800-171 is derived from 853. And we had done an update to 853 a couple years ago and just needed to get everything in sync. If nothing else, that was kind of one of the major drivers. The threat landscape has changed. The underlying controls that federal agencies use to protect CUI and all of their information systems have evolved. So keeping things in sync just makes sense. So Rev 3 goes through some pretty basic changes. We expanded the families from 14 to 17 for a better alignment with Rev 5. And I think Andy you want to dive into some of the control families later. So I'll say
Absolutely.
we'll do rapid fire and see if I can remember them all off the top of my head. So in addition to kind of expanding the catalog, we really reframed the security requirements so you see that better direct alignment and tie to 853. Now, the original intent of 171 was to really make this set of requirements really non-federal, the set of 853 controls that apply to protecting CUI, the confidentiality of CUI to a non-federal audience. And I think there was immense value in the time, why it was done that way at that time when it originally was developed way back when in 2015, 2016. I think a lot has changed since then. I think there's a lot of lessons learned, both good and bad, that informed why we made some of these changes. First and foremost, we made each and every security requirement more detailed, not more prescriptive, but more detailed so you could see that direct tie back to 853. We did some restructuring to make them better aligned, but now you see how 171 really is essentially a CUI overlay for the 853 controls. We clarified our the tailoring criteria. We simplified it and we expanded it. I think one of the biggest pieces of feedback we got were why people hated the NFO controls. So the ones that we assumed that organizations were just doing. We were seeing a lot of inconsistency in those assessments. Of some assessors wanted to see it, others didn't. It was a bad assumption on our part because if we really expect people to be doing something, we should just be very explicit and say it. So we covered some of those basic things like policy and planning explicitly in this update. And we removed the NFO tailoring category completely. We added an NA category to address the PM controls and the privacy, the PT family from 853, just because they're not within the scope of protecting confidentiality of CUI at the system level because they weren't tied to the moderate impact baseline for security. And then we expanded the NCOs and the Fed controls for alignment and kind of did a whole refresh. That was a really big structural change to how we selected and showed that traceability back to 53. We introduced everyone's favorite ODPs. There are no controversies around ODPs, right? This allows both the federal agency and the non-federal entity to have some flexibility in implementation. I think there was a huge hubbub when the drafts of 171 Rev 3 were out of who defines ODPs, who owns them. And like any good former consultant, I would say it depends. Not all ODPs are created equal, right? Not every ODP should and would be defined by the federal agency that you're working with. Some are really just make sure that you are thinking about risk management as you're implementing that 853 control or security requirement. Ultimately, what we saw was the DOW put out a list of the ODPs they cared about and how they wanted them tailored. And I do believe that many civilian federal agencies that will also be using 171 are just going to follow suit with what the work the DOW already did, because why recreate the wheel? So I think that's kind of the trend that's going in. And I think those are kind of the major ones. We did some other things like eliminate basic
Yeah.
versus derived requirement,
Yeah.
but details.
Let's talk about the ODPs real quick as a concept, because there has already been, Rev 3 is still theoretical for the vast majority of the ecosystem that I'm in. I'm very deep in the DoD, DoW world, in the CMMC world, and all that, and we've been on Rev 2. Rev 3 has been, in theory, means we've been spending a lot of time discussing it, and on ODP specifically, the way we interpret it is that essentially the federal agency has the first right of refusal to define an ODP, or could provide guidelines on what they would like those ODPs to be. And if they don't define it, then it flows down to your organization at some point, if it hasn't been defined by somebody else in the chain to define what that ODP should say.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
Cool. All right, I nailed it. I'm so far so good. One of the things that I really enjoyed about our conversation on the Watchers, not to overly plug something that we've already done, but I kept that conversation pretty high level and broad, and I really was asking about NIST's intent and NIST's perspective on building cybersecurity. And I want to press a little further specifically into 171 and ask some around the intent. What I can say so far about CMMC, as far as I know, like the primary implementation of 800-171 and validation of it that's happened has been under the CMMC model. And I know you're not here to answer for CMMC, but what I've seen is 800-171 Rev 2 has been treated as a bare minimum. And some of the interpretations have been fairly strict, where my impression of interacting with you has been like, hey, reason should be part of the conversation here. It's not always like take the most strict reading of how we wrote it and maybe get a little more at the intent. Can you speak to that?
I mean,
Is
I
it too
think
open-ended?
at the end of the day, right, there has to be a baseline. There has to be a common taxonomy and understanding of some of the fundamental security requirements or security things that have to happen with an organization, a system. If you're storing, transmitting, processing, if you're doing stuff with CY, right, whether you're in the government, whether you're in private sector. And I do think that, one of the challenges of NIST is, what is that Goldilocks just right? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? What is the level of detail? How prescriptive do we need to be? At the end of the day, from NIST perspective, we are looking at good security outcomes. How do we protect the confidentiality of this information? So I know, between you and Jacob and some of the famous or infamous folks in the ecosystem, you can dissect each and every security requirement and debate where the commas are and what we meant by that exactly. But sometimes I always think it's important to take a step back and look at the forest amongst the trees, right? Like each security requirement has a specific intent, and there's a general outcome that you're really shooting for. And I think there is a little bit of ambiguity in how each assessor, how each organization is going to interpret exactly what they want. But let's not lose the whole point of it, right? If you treat this as a compliance activity, as a check the box, go down the list and do everything, you are getting nothing more than a compliance checklist. Are you truly managing the risk? Are you truly protecting the information? Because that's the end goal at the end of the day. I mean, I know that everyone wants to have that perfect SPRS score or, have that, check the box. I did the assessment. I'm good for 3 years, or I self-attested. I'm good. But are you meeting the intent of why we're doing this?
For 800 specifically, you've mentioned this a couple of times. We're using the phrase protect the confidentiality of CUI. So can we speak to maybe what 800 is not intended to do, like address the more broader cybersecurity program requirements you may still have?
I mean, so I will say if you have nothing in place for cybersecurity, 171 isn't a bad place to start, especially if you have to implement it, right? But let's be very clear that protecting the confidentiality of information is only a piece of that, security triad of protecting the confidentiality, protecting the integrity, and protecting the availability of information, right? Confidential means you're only sharing it with the people that need to have it. Integrity means it's good, it's right, it's correct data and information. And available means it's there for you when you need. In order to have a strong, robust cybersecurity program, you need pieces of all of that. Now, there's going to vary, what's more important in which context and yada, yada. But protecting confidentiality is only one part of having a comprehensive cybersecurity program. So when you look at 171, you get confidentiality requirements. You also get a little bit of the integrity requirements because you can't really completely bifurcate confidentiality and integrity. But I can be very clear that we really don't address availability in the 171 requirements. So that is something that's really important. Think about the availability of, say, your cell phone, the cell phone system, right? If all the cell towers go down, that's probably really bad. Now, if a single website for Sentinel Blue went down for an hour or so, that would be bad, but not same level of
Unacceptable.
catastrophic bad, right? So I think you really have to consider the context of everything else that you need for cybersecurity. Now, people ask, is 171 a good starting point? Again, if you've got to comply with 171, you got to do it anyways. It doesn't hurt, but it doesn't take you all the way to getting that robust risk management program. You meet a compliance requirement when you meet the 171 requirements.
Yeah, and 171 bakes in some governance, right? And it's,
A
for a
little
lot of the
bit. We
organizations.
tried to go real light touch on that policy, the policy one, when we updated the tailoring guidelines in Rev 3. But I don't think it's necessarily as comprehensive as, say, 853, talking about the PM family, talking about organization-wide risk management, because again, it is really scoped to those systems and components that store, transmit, process CUI, or provide the security for them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good backdrop to start the conversation. Just a reminder that it's, you are not absolved of addressing other cybersecurity risks outside of the fairly narrow focus that is the confidentiality of a controlled data type. You still have, confidentiality of other data types that hopefully you treat the same way as CUI, like proprietary data. But then, yeah, keeping your systems, there's a real push for more resiliency in the defense industrial base in my world, coming from the current DoD, where they're stressing that a bit more, and that's part of your broader cybersecurity program. So I think
It's also
some
just
people have
good
gotten
for
a little too
business
locked in.
too, right?
Right.
Even
Yeah,
without
you should want to be
or
resilient.
yeah, even without an external factor, for your own business sake, resilience is probably a good thing.
Yeah, 100%. So, great context. Now, I want to explore 171 and start with just the control families. And like you, I feel like I could do them all. The new ones I don't have, but the existing ones I've done like 30 some odd CMMC level 2 assessments. So I know RSSP like the back of my hand, and I know control families fairly well. But I just want to kind of recap, what is the outcome intended by a control family? So control family, as I see them, it's a grouping of requirements that are all working toward a similar outcome. They're addressing a similar underlying risk. Is that sort of an accurate way to frame it?
Good way to frame it. It's just things that are similar that support like an objective. And I think this is the true test, guys. Do I remember them in alphabetical order without looking? Without looking. Okay.
Yeah, so we'll watch your eyes and see if you're looking off to the
Okay.
side.
Okay.
But I'm here to
Like,
help if
phone
you
is blank.
need.
Phone is blank. I can phone a friend if
Yeah.
needed.
So let's start with 3.1 or 0.03.01.
All
Now,
right,
when you're ready.
access control. That one's easy because that's my favorite control family for a fun trivia fact because it comes first and is so foundational. You ain't got nothing if you don't have access control. All right, so the whole point of access control is to make sure only the people that need access to the thing have it, right? Or people or processes acting on behalf of people, because we all have agents doing our job for us now. So we're thinking
Increasingly so.
account management, remote access, just making sure that the people and things that shouldn't have access to the information don't. Easy
All
peasy.
right.
All right.
Easy peasy, but
Easy peasy.
hugely important to nail that because so much flows from good access control.
It's so foundational. I would argue the only thing slightly more foundational than that is having good governance. Because if you don't have good governance, you're just doing good cybersecurity practices based on feels. Which, I mean, your feelings are
Vibes,
important, but
vibe-based security, it's big.
I don't know. Vibe coding's a thing. Vibe security. Anyways, all right.
2026 is the year of the vibe.
All right. After AC is AT, awareness and training. Okay,
All right.
so do
2
the
for 2.
people know what they need to do, and are they equipped from a security perspective to do their jobs security and understand the security risks and do their jobs and make good security decisions? Do they know their roles? Do they know their responsibilities? Are they doing it?
Solid. All right, 2 for 2.
All right. All right. Audit. Audit and accountability. AU. So how do you know you did the right things when it's not if, it's when something goes wrong? So do you know did you create, did you retain, did you review the right system logs so you have that data set to go back for those reviews, right? How do you know that the users did the right thing, that you had the right protections in place? How do you break down and kind of figure out what went wrong when something goes wrong?
Yeah, making sure that the system is tracking what goes on in the system so you can piece together what happened when, to your point, something inevitably goes wrong, because it
Something is
will.
going to go wrong. Hopefully, it's a small thing.
Right. It doesn't always have to be somebody trying to do something wrong. I'm a seasoned systems admin. I can tell you, I've made a lot of mistakes that logs helped me piece together like, oh yeah, I did do that last week.
One time
Whoops.
when I was an intern, I accidentally restarted an operational server during the middle of the day.
Yeah.
Did I get
You
some
haven't been
phone
in
calls?
IT if you haven't, if you haven't affected prod, like if you haven't brought down prod, you can't say that you've been in IT long enough,
Fair. Okay, I think that hits all the A's. So we're at 3.
Yep.
We've done 3.
Yep. 3, 4.
All right. Configuration management? Yes. Okay. All right. Do you know what your system looks like or what it should look like when something goes wonky? Can you
I
get it
like it.
back to a state of good? So this means everything from kind of the policy and procedure that governs it to actually the technical details of what that system looks like, because you need to have a known good to get back to.
Right. And then there's a big core concept that you could tie to other security frameworks, just change control is where configuration management is where, 800.171 homes change control and establishing not just like, hey, does the system have a baseline, but when you're going to deviate from that or when you're going to update that, manage it there.
And because let's be very frank, the only consistency that we can expect is constant change, right? Your system is going to
Absolutely.
be a general same function, but the threat landscape is going to move way faster than anything else is going to move. So how do we adjust as necessary to adjust so we can manage those risks?
Can I press on that a little bit, not to take us totally off track, but one of the criticisms or one of the challenges has kind of been that we've been on Rev 2 for a decade, essentially, and that technology changes, evolves so quickly. I do think Rev 3 allows for more flexibility, but I think because the way that's been used as, unfortunately, like a compliance or a checklist, I have found a lot of people come in and try to really lock it in to like how it was the day it was written. And I try to tell people like, hey, we're supporting security outcomes for technology that changes. We have to be able to adapt the requirement in reasonable ways to meet the intent, even if it doesn't specifically meet the most exact conservative reading that you can make of a specific requirement. Do you have a thought on that?
Concur, right? Even the way that Rev 2 is written, and I know that is kind of what's the deployed base. They are still outcome focused objectives, and it's written in that way for a reason, right? There is no way that any standard, any technical guideline is going to keep up with the pace of technology change, with the pace that society is innovating and using it, especially since I'm going to say the two magical letters AI, right? There is no way we can crank out anything to keep pace with that. Not at that level of detail. But when you develop these kind of standards, guidelines, frameworks, whatever you want to call them, and are really focused on outcomes, the outcomes largely don't change with time, right? Good access control is still good access control, whether you're still using your like Windows NT box or whether you're using the latest and greatest, right? You're only supposed to let the people that need access to the thing have it. How it's implemented is obviously going to change wildly given your architecture, given the context, yada, yada. But that outcome stays really relatively unchanged. So I do always heed caution. And, we talk about this a lot. This is kind of probably one of our soapbox issues of don't lose the forest from the trees, right? Are we achieving the outcome rather than focusing on the commas or the semicolons or like, what did you mean by and here?
Yeah. I think, would you say that you encourage the change? Like we don't, because what I find is a lot of people feel discouraged to change their systems because of the fear that they're going to deviate and, misstep in some, again, very strict reading of things. So they end up making decisions that I think are probably short-sighted and it's tree focused, not forest focused. But because they're afraid of making the change,
I think we need to really focus that conversation on, all right, what is the goal of this requirement? What kind of risk are we trying to manage? And how does your implementation really manage the risk rather than really looking at like, okay, we've broken this security requirement down into the most, minimum parts. Like, do we need to be super literal and saying this part of this requirement needs to apply at every single point of the system? Rather, where in the system does this requirement make the most sense and provide the protections needed? And I think
I
that
think
does.
that might be like, sorry, there might be a slight delay. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Leave with that. If you
I
get
was gonna
nothing
say
else,
that is like
end now.
quotable.
Done.
Yeah.
Bye.
That's like the thesis. That's the thesis I think is so important that people understand from you. Because there's gonna be some examples when we get into some of the specific controls. Like I was looking at 3.1.1, and if you read it a certain way, which I know the ecosystem will someone in the ecosystem will read it a certain way. There's a requirement under the new 3.1.1 that says like, hey, disable accounts when, and one of them says when it's no longer associated with a user or an individual. And my brain immediately went like, is this NIST declaring that shared accounts of any kind are no longer allowed? Which I don't think was the point you were trying to make with that. But you could read it like, hey, if it's not associated with an individual or a user, it has to be disabled per the requirement.
That's interesting.
So,
I will keep that in mind for the next update that I'm not going to
yeah,
spoil.
I'm not trying to pick at that one in particular, but it goes back to the point that you're making, which is like, hey, don't miss the forest of the trees. There has to be some reasonable interpretation. There's no way, it's an impossible task for NIST to try to write something that's going to be 100% understood and that's going to be universally acceptable in all scenarios. So I think you describing the intent behind things and the interpretation from NIST being, if I could put words in your mouth, like, hey, be reasonable, like understand the intent that we're getting at. And if you're addressing that intent, great. That's what we wanted you to do.
That was the point. Because if NIST were to be super prescriptive, the second we put something out, it's already out of date. It's already moot, right? Or it already doesn't apply to a massive percentage of the population because everyone has a different implementation or architecture. So really, the goal is, I know we've been successful when I've pissed everyone off. Everyone has a complaint. Everyone's not happy. Good. Done.
Right. If no one has an opinion on it, what are we doing?
And then I'm definitely doing it wrong.
For sure.
All right, we did configuration.
So the curve, yeah, I was gonna say the curveball comes after configuration management because we skip a couple letters here. So what comes next?
So we got rid of C. Yeah, that's not in there. All right. I think that there's something before incident response. IA,
There you go.
identification and authentication. So do you know the users, the processes, the devices, right? Are they real? Are they the ones that this should be there? I think the big one there is we changed it where MFA is everywhere all the time. Um, if you don't know who you have, if you can't verify the identity, how are you going to give that? How are you going to have good access control? It goes back to my favorite family.
Yeah, and those two, they're siblings in my experience. They're so closely related. Do you see a delineation like what makes something an access control requirement versus an IA requirement?
I mean, so I actually had dinner with Ron last night, and we were just chatting of
Shout
the
out Ron Ross.
the Ron Ross, the Dr. Ron Ross. But we were chatting and saying, over time, 853 has evolved. More controls went in. There are a lot of overlapping or similar controls, and I don't know if it was intentional or not intentional. It just kind of happened with time. The catalog has grown, and we were thinking about what are the opportunities to kind of streamline it and kind of bifurcate. You'll see in a lot of control enhancements very similar ones in different families because they enhance a base control in a slightly different way. Anyways, long story short, a lot of the controls are interrelated. The IA and AC family are just one example. Let's see how time will only tell how we kind of evolve the catalog to better streamline it, which is my spoiler for 53.
Hey, you heard it here first.
That's right.
All
I
right,
mean,
so we got
I gotta
IA.
keep something, right?
Yeah, no, that's what we're here for. We're here for the things that you can sprinkle, to get us excited, keep us on the hook. All right, so after identification, authentication, you already mentioned the next one, which is incident response.
Instant
What are we
response,
doing
all
there?
right. When something goes wrong, what do you do? Do you have your process to detect, you know, understand what happened, respond to it, get back to it, the status quo? How do you recover? It's kind of foundational, right?
Yep,
Is
totally,
everything
and fairly straightforward.
all
It's one
right?
of those that can go a mile deep, right? You can really go deep, and I think commensurate with the risk that your organization faces. I've seen people over-engineer it for their very small and under-engineer it for their like very wide enterprise. So I think that you need to be wise in how you implement that.
I think it's, having that foundational process in place and understanding when to go deeper is kind of that's the challenging part, right? Because I do think not only is it based on the organization, the type of system and type of information, it depends on what happens. It's like when you bring an old car to the mechanic and they find one problem and they dig a little deeper and find more problems. Like how deep do you need to go?
Yeah. Well, and another thesis that I think that you can point out there that you're making is there is no getting around. You have to be informed. There's no getting around. You're going to have to make informed decisions. Again, NIST can't stipulate because people always drive it down to like just tell me exactly what I need to do. Like
If
if
I was
it's
going to tell
if
you exactly what you needed to do, I might as well just do your job.
right, and
I,
that's
can I have
well,
your
listen,
paycheck?
maybe we could trade. I don't know. I'll have to consider
Well,
that,
I mean,
but
like you know how much feds make, so
that's true. That is public record. That's fair. Um, all right, so we cover incident response. Next up, we have 3.7.
all right, 3.7. IR. All right, now we're at the M's. Before media
You're
is
good.
maintenance. Maintenance. You got to fix. You got to keep things functioning, right? It's preventative, routine things to keep your systems functioning, and what you do when something happens that you need to do the updates and keep the show running.
Baller. 3.8.
Okay.
So I've turned this into a game show at
I
this
know this is
point, and
like a
I'm having
game
too much
show.
fun with it to
Do you
change.
think there's I hope someone has like a bet on if I can get them all and which one I'm gonna miss.
I will open up some betting for folks.
Okay. Media protection. How do you protect the the system media, digital and physical? I do know that DOW scoped out physical CUI, but I would just say digital and physical for the scope of what NIST had.
Okay, so you're talking about where DOW kind of they came out and said like, hey, if your company doesn't deal with anything digital and you only get paper CUI, they've sort of said these requirements don't apply.
Yeah, that. I I mean, that's not NIST role. But in this, when we designed the MP family, it was for both physical and digital. So like your printouts, your hard drives, your, everything going through the internet. Okay.
Got it.
Done with M. P. So we don't have PM because that's scoped out. Personnel security. People. Do you vet the people, whether they be part of your organization or down your supply chain, to be the right people to have access to that type of data? And this is really important for CUI because certain types of CUI have different markings that allow or disallow access for certain populations of people.
Right. So you need to know who you have. You need to know that they're
Are you people
vetted,
legit?
that they're appropriate. It's great summary. All right.
Yeah, you can during your next assessment be like, P.S. You all legit? Cool. Okay, so P after PS, physical and environmental. Your guards, gates, and guns. Your physical access to the systems. So whether it's kind of that really physical, is it the badge access to the infrastructure? Do you have the right, temperature, humidity things to make sure that your services, well, not in the scope of this, but are available as necessary to protect the system and the information.
Another that I think is pretty straightforward, right? And it can go fairly deep, but making sure you have the right people and that the facility is protected and that the CUI as it transits is protected and all that. Tends to be, at least my experience so far, it tends to be the more easy to understand because it's the physical world.
It's
It's
not
right in
really
front of you.
abstracted, right? There's only so many levels you
Yeah,
can abstract it down. Of course, you can overcomplicate anything, but this one's
of
pretty
course. And
straight.
people
It's,
do, man.
you should
They
do
just
these things anyways, right? I hope you vet your staff. I hope you
yes.
lock up your business when you go home at night, digital or not.
Right. All right. So we got
Um,
that's you're 10 for 10, by the way.
I mean, for better or worse, I think I've spent a lot of time with these requirements. Where we have
Yeah,
like a long term bad relationship. I don't know.
I get it. I get it. I
All
feel
right,
the same way.
the new one. This is one of the new ones that we added in Rev 3 is planning. And this was as a result of getting rid of that NFO category, right? We formalized, basically, we move the system security plan and the POAM requirement in there. Are you doing the planning stuff to make sure that all the other things can happen? Because again, we're not doing security based on vibes. Or maybe you are,
Would you
but
say again, playing security through vibes is like the MO, right, for security people. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody. I always like to start with a good vibe. Would you say planning is like a foundational step? Like things kind of start and flow from there?
I mean, so I don't want to make it sound like that, documenting what you do is the end all be all because like I'm that is not my vantage point on good security. However, good security you should be able to replicate it, right? If you hit the lottery tomorrow, you would want your organization, your company to carry on because someone knew what you were doing, had a good idea of what you're doing or the approach that you had to success. And I think that's one of the key things for planning. I think in a lot of scenarios, organizations treat this as their paperwork exercise, as their compliance exercise, as their way to, get through their audit or assessment. And really, this really can and should serve as that kind of foundation for your strong security program. So rather than treating it as a paperwork compliance activity, treat it as, all right, this is how I know that when I win the lottery, my organization, my team can continue to be successful because we have a good foundation, because people know what we have in place to accomplish these good things. And I think, I don't know, like it's a little bit of like check in the vibe to make it a little more positive and really stop treating it as a paperwork activity.
Which I think, it's like incident response, in that it can go so deep, right? And I think it's wise to establish sufficiency for your level of effort and what you output here. to a reasonable level to the organization, the enterprise, or the systems that you're protecting here. Another common thing I've seen in the last several years have been organizations overly building out their planning, like the level of depth. We're talking like 80,000 words, system security plans, and deep policy, and all this like amazing governance to protect 10 people, right? And then missing some of the technical depth that you would like to see, but so over
You
engineered on
need
that
the
front.
right
Like,
balance of both. You absolutely need
yeah,
the right balance of both. And again, I think there's a lot of opportunity in like leveraging some of the governance risk and compliance tools that are out there so it doesn't become a paperwork exercise. So some of your, more technical controls or requirements, they can be pulled from data and sensors on your network rather than some poor sap updating a Word document like once a week or whatever their necessary frequency is. Like it doesn't, again, let's not overthink this, right? So sometimes common sense is actually the best solution.
yeah, and like again, to quote things that we can get from you today that I can point to, be like, guys, the literal author over here is saying that sufficiency of our control depends. Like it's going to require reasonable position. It would obviously make no sense for a massive 50,000 person enterprise to have 10 pages of security documentation. We know the risk level, we know the complexity of that organization suggests, unless it's the best 10 pages of all time that have been written, it's going to need more to it. But the same standard you're going to apply to them, and you come into a 10-person organization that's operating an enclave for the purposes here, like these have to operate on different spectrums, and we can't, you can't go in with the same mindset every time that the same
It's
things
not
have
a
to be
one size
true
fit
in the
all
exact same way.
solution. I mean, and that's
Yeah.
why in kind of 800, 171, and 853 alpha, 800, 171 alpha, and 53 alpha, we talk about the depth and the breadth of assessment, right? It's how wide and deep you go. It's all based on risk. It's based on context to decide what is sufficient. What, like you said, it has to scale to what you're trying to do, and it has to make sense. Otherwise, we're just wasting time or not doing enough.
I want to put a pin in the assessment
So we'll
publications,
be back.
the sister publications to 171. Yeah, yeah. All right, so let's round this out. Let's
Okay,
rapid fire. Let's see what we got for the next 6 families left.
7. Okay. We got through planning. Risk assessment, easy peasy.
Yeah.
How do you
Okay.
assess the risk to your operations from this system, or the everything storing, processing, transmitting CUI. So everything from vulnerability scanning, risk analysis, threat assessment, that whole shebang. How do you know what you're actually doing?
Solid.
And
Love it.
one caveat is, in some ways, the security requirement assessment is a type of risk assessment if you think about it. Ooh, very
Yeah,
much.
and that's one of the. There's definitely some. It's another one of those like access control and IA where very sibling requirement set.
So I guess okay, what's next? R
You
S
already said it.
S. Ooh, did I say it? Oh no! Oh no, am I missing something?
No, I mean you said it in relation to risk assessment, right?
Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, control assessment. So yeah. All right. There's that. Assessment. And I think we renamed it in 53, so it's security assessment and monitoring. So how do you know if the controls or requirements are in place, operating as intended, and achieving the desired results? Right. And this includes the assessment, the poems, stuff like that. I think I would have missed that. So you were my phone a friend on that. Thanks, man.
You still get credit for that.
Okay. System and Communications Protection, SC. So this is where we get into the real technical controls or the technical requirements of doing the things rather than the policy and procedures. How do you really protect the information within the system boundaries and across as it leaves? So everything from I guess like things like network segmentation to our favorite FIPS related controls
We're
and
going to talk about that. We're going to
oh,
talk
I know
about
we're
that.
going to talk about that. So how do we protect the information? when it leaves. Next is system integrity. And I know that integrity isn't explicitly, it's not explicitly in because we're focused on confidentiality, but they are, intertwined whether you like it or not. So, how do you know that basically this is like identifying system flaws and software vulnerabilities and making sure that you have malicious code protection? Because while that is primarily focused on some integrity, it also touches the confidentiality of information as well. All right. Oh, how many do we have left? How many do we have left?
You got two left. You got two left. And there are two new ones.
They all new? Okay. Definitely one is supply chain risk management because, I think CUI 171 has always been a little bit about protecting information in the supply chain because it's in the non-federal system.
Certainly in practice, it has been.
So, like, how do you identify, evaluate, and manage the risks with the system components, the software, from a cybersecurity supply chain risk management perspective? Some of these controls in 53 were migrated over from the systems and service acquisition family, which kind of had them both before. So that segues and think maybe into the last one. Is that the last one?
That is the last one.
Out of order.
17 for 17.
Out of order, but the system and services acquisition, this is actually, you're right, another new family that we had explicitly scoped out before. But really, when you think about the application of 171, it really is about the systems and services acquisition and supply chain risk management. So, yeah, there we go.
So there you have a condensed. If you want all of the authors' thoughts on what these control families are intended to accomplish, you just read the document because it's all written out in the discussions for each requirement explicitly, sort of what the intent was. But I thought it'd be good to just the summary of each control family. Like, hey, when you're thinking through what these requirements are trying to accomplish, there you go. That's what we're looking for. That's the outcome that we're going for. So great. Thank you for doing the fun of running the ringer there. You nailed it. 17 for 17.
I mean, I won't say, I think I was almost at 16 out of 17, but, thanks for the save.
Hey, teamwork makes the dream work. All right. So I do have some specific requirement questions that I want to get into. A lot of what I participate in a lot of discussion online about requirements, a lot of debate. You would be shocked how many man hours have been spent debating some of the requirements. We'll bring some of those up. Before we get into that, I want to quickly deviate into the assessment publication. So there's a corresponding publication, 800-171 Alpha, now at Rev 3 as well, to be the companion to 171 Rev 3. The Alpha documents in my world, in the DOW CMMC world, have become really the rubric, the scoring rubric for how you're being validated that you're actually doing the requirements. And here's what I would say has happened. They've become the shadow requirements. I think most companies that have gone through CMMC didn't have to comply with NIST 800-171. They had to comply with NIST 800-171 Alpha. I don't imagine that was the intent, or what the intent of the Alpha documents is.
Why would people treat them as different? I guess is kind of my initial I think I understand I think I know what answer you're going to give me, but yeah.
So here's what I would say. My experience has been we've done over 25 assessments in CMMC. We've done several with the DCMA DIPCAC team. Often we try to describe, hey, here's how we're approaching access control. We have found that assessors are often like, that's great. Thank you for all that information about your smart, reasoned approach to access control. We would now like to talk to you about 3.1.1 Alpha. Are the system users sufficiently authorized to access the system? Because it's been devolved into hey, here's our checklist that we have to validate you against. They just rush straight to that sort of outcome. And what it has, I don't want to deviate way too often to a tangent because we're talking about the future. We're talking about Rev 3 here. But what I've seen happen and what I want to ask you about intent for is people just devolve it into the checklist and say, okay, you have to meet every single assessment objective in order to pass for a particular requirement. It doesn't lead itself to a lot of nuanced or intent-based conversation around a requirement, what we end up optimizing for is how do I answer the questions I know an assessor is going to ask about the specific assessment objectives that are coming.
Now, do those necessarily have to be at odds with one another? Now, the way that assessments are conducted, that's probably out of the scope of what we can solve today. But is there that happy medium between kind of meeting the intent or that security outcome and still being able to answer the assessment question that you know is coming? And like, so that's where I would ask you as the one that both implements and evaluates, what
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
that merges into like a happy medium.
Well, one of the things I really like about Alpha Rev 3 is it talks about an assurance case. I think that's the term that's used. Yeah, assurance case and building an effective assurance case. Um, I'm much more interested when I'm on the assessment side. I'm much more interested in understanding, okay, I know what the intent of this requirement is. Tell me all the ways that you've built your system, configured it, and your processes to meet this intended outcome. And then I go through the assessment objectives and like, if we're matching, great. That's how this should be used. What I see happening is a very literal, if, in the new Rev 3, 3.1.1 has 28 assessment objectives. And under the current mode, if you got one of those off, you get no credit for your whole access control capability, which I don't know if that's the intent. Like, hey, this requirement isn't satisfied unless we have test examined and or interviewed to cover each of these objectives, or if it's, hey, these are useful in building your assurance case, but you're responsible for building the assurance case.
So the assurance case ties back to that assessment depth and breadth, right? The level of assurance that you need to know that something is there and doing what it should is going to vary based on that context, based on the risk, based on the potential importance of that requirement. I think even in the SPRS score, in the scoring schema, right? Each security requirement kind of has a different score or different value or weight that should indicate its relative importance per DOW, right? Straight from the horse's mouth there. So in terms of assurance, you need to know that the depth and breadth of assessment helps build that assurance case. If something is relatively less important, you probably need fewer artifacts or fewer methods to evaluate are they doing this? Maybe if it has a higher score, you should probably look at you should look at different artifacts, use different methods to make sure that you're building a comprehensive story. So I wish there was kind of a one size fit all solution, but I do really think this is a little bit of shades of gray and back to using common sense, right? Should that 10-person company be going through that same level of rigor for a, standalone, system versus a large defense contractor that has hundreds and thousands of endpoints and so, ins and outs? So it all should be relative to what's in front of you, right? The information still holds that same value. You should still be protecting it. But what is sufficient for what you have in front of you and how it's being used?
Yeah, it's the counter to an earlier point where it's, hey, you're not going to get around the need to make informed decisions as the company implementing the requirements. But I think the assessment world that I'm in also needs to understand you don't get off without having to build some understanding and making informed decisions. It can't be devolved into a common set of grades that we score everyone the same way. It's just not practical, and it's not going to
It
achieve the
doesn't
outcome
scope
that I
and
think
scale that
we're
way.
going for.
It wouldn't scope and scale that
Right.
way in a reasonably anyways.
Yeah, so some of what we've seen is very strict interpretations. We've seen people really split hairs over, the minutia of how an assessment objective itself is stated, and have to like draw it back and be like, guys, can we come back up to what the requirement says? I'm not kidding when I tell you we've done almost 30 assessments, I guess. I don't remember maybe more than one time I've actually talked about a requirement from 171 instead of an assessment objective. Almost always, if we get into a debate, some pushback, we're fighting over an assessment objective statement. we're like 3.1.1 alpha in the current Rev 2. We're talking about our system users identified. Like we split hairs over what that means. And I'm like, we're showing you the system and we're showing you how like they have
We know
to
who these people are,
authenticate and
where
all
they
this.
are.
Right. But that's, people optimize for that. And that's what I mean by it's become a shadow requirement set, which I think, wasn't the intent as I understand it.
No, no, it wasn't. And I'll tell you another secret. When we say identify or document, sometimes we just change up the word because it's really annoying to say identify every single time. It kind of means the same thing, right? In order to document, you kind of have to identify. If you identify and don't document, what was the point? Right. So I think it's so interesting to hear these like discussions about semantics when sometimes we were just trying to not be super boring using English.
Well, and what I always tell people now that I've had these conversations with you, like NIST is reasonable, man. Like they want you to they want us to use good reason. They want us to address the outcomes. They don't want us fighting over minutia of a strict way they worded when they chose between identify and document.
I would love to hear how many people have had debates about that. So you let me know.
I would bet close to 100% of people that have gone through CMMC level 2. And I'm not kidding.
Sorry.
It's just the nature of the way things have gone.
Never
So
the intent. How about that? That was never the intent. Identify and
you heard it
document
here.
technically mean the same thing.
You heard it here first. All right, so we'll stay on alpha real quick, and then I want to bring it back to the requirements. I want to be respectful of your time as well. Would it generally be understood that, if you are building an insurance case, we want each assessment objective to be met in some capacity? Or is it like, hey, use a reasonable sampling? Do you have an opinion on how it's used?
I think it's going to have to depend a little. This is the worst answer, and you're going to hate me. It really is going to depend on context. I don't think every single you. I don't think it would be reasonable to evaluate every single assessment case for every single endpoint or entry point or every single item of the system. Like we have to make the scope and the scale something that can be accomplished by both the assessor and reasonable to the organization. Especially in given how kind of system architectures, how organizations are built now, are you ever going to evaluate 100%? Really, are you?
It's not feasible.
It's not feasible. So at what point do you have enough for that assurance case saying that, look, we've seen, X number of examples that show this spread of their systems, they're doing a good job here. They should be fine elsewhere. I don't think it would be reasonable to expect that every single assessment procedure is applied to every single endpoint or every single system component, because you'd still probably be in an assessment from like 3 years ago now.
I've been through some lengthy assessments, I can tell you. And I feel like I've been in one continuous one for some time, but
New names
yeah,
shall be named.
no, absolutely not. That's helpful perspective, and I think it's again the theme, the through line is so clear that I hope a lot of people watch it, and I hope people listen when you speak. Like, don't lose the forest for the trees, man. Come
Let's be
on,
reasonable, folks.
please. And yes, I think everyone understands there's subjectivity to reason, but I think some people just need a lot of folks in the C3PAO community have said things like we feel like our hands are tied on certain things because some of the way 80171 has been used, not by NIST, but through the way DoD has pushed it. They feel like our hands are tied, like the requirements written a certain way. And I think the more we can drive to like, hey, what was the intent here? The better we can actually achieve the outcome that we're going for, which is protecting confidentiality of a data that is important to protect the confidentiality of. All right, so you've entertained my pet topics. Entertain me a little further if you would do me the solid. I have a handful of controls from Rev 3 that I want to ask you about. Some of them are like, hey, I've seen how it's been implemented so far, and I'm curious what your take is on it. Some of them are, hey, this is new, and I'm interested, to explore a bit more. The first one, I'm going to open up a can of worms that I think we could probably spend the rest of the time on its own, which is 3.1.1, if you just start there, um, we refer to the system in a lot of the requirements. The system, quote, big quote unquote there. Is the system all of its components? Is the system more abstract? You brought this up already when you said, like, hey, it's maybe not necessarily that every assessment objective applies to every single component of the system, every single endpoint. But the way you could read a lot of the requirements is like, hey, the system, if it encompasses everything, that means everything applies everywhere all the time. What is the system?
So the system, my favorite answer is it depends, right? So the way that 171 is scoped is everything that stores, processes, transmits CUI, or provides security protections. It's within the bounds of 171. When this comes to when we look at implementation, I think we have the opportunity to create almost subsystems, little enclaves within the broader system that you're applying the security. So the system can be, you could try to limit the scope of the requirements to minimize how you apply the requirements. I think that is just a general strategy that I've seen used by non-federal entities. So I don't think I have a specific answer of what the system
Yeah.
itself would be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be everything within your enterprise. But any
Yeah, no,
touches the CUI, right? So how do we scope that down from your entire organization to just where you're doing CUI stuff?
yeah, I think logic will end up guiding for a lot of the conversation. I've seen it really happen where, there are certain system components where like some of the requirements just don't really apply to a certain system component, but we know which ones do. And so we're going to evaluate those and spend less time on the other things. To use an example that I pulled out of 3.1.1, there's, the requirement that users log out of the system after an ODP of unexpected inactivity, or I'm sorry, of expected inactivity or when some other circumstance. Log out of the system could mean, like if I take a common architecture we use, you have a big Microsoft 365 environment and you have a lot of people with laptops that connect to the Microsoft 365 where the data is primarily stored, but I have a little CUI maybe on my laptop. Am I to log out of my laptop? Is it sufficient to lock it? Is that the system that I log out of, or is it the Microsoft big part of the system?
I think in a lot of cases, it's less of like what you would do, but it's how your organization sets up the policy. So if I were to walk away from my computer and not lock it, which is against our policy, because, I would never break our policy, it would lock the screen after
Yep.
X
Session
minutes,
lock.
2, 3 minutes or whatever. And it would disconnect from the network, kind of basically severing all our 365 or, any of those connections after another period of time. So is it truly, what are we scoping this system as? It's not just the endpoint. I think there's a lot of ways that this can be implemented in such a way that it really does, it's agnostic of the user. Yes, I'm supposed to, control, or I don't know. I use a Mac, so I use the mouse gesture to my corner to lock the screen, and then everything else will lock out after a certain amount of time. So I don't know if we're overthinking this one, even like that use case.
I think a lot of what I've seen is people there's a not the same requirement, but there's a requirement that you can read a certain way in Rev 2 that's like, hey, users need to like log out of the system. And I've seen people peddle the idea like, hey, people at the end of their workday need to like on their laptop or whatever, go click log out, first lock, put it on sleep mode and wake it up and log back in. So I've seen people say, hey, we're going to force the entire company to reboot at the end of the workday. So it forces everybody out so that we know everyone logged out. And I've said, I don't know that that was kind of the intent. I think maybe, we would like to force everyone to log out of the central remote desktop service or out of the big central repository of data.
Just kick
That
everyone out at the end of the day after some inactivity. So don't make them do anything. Just kick them out.
Sure, from those systems, but like the laptop one in particular, I've had battles over because most people don't log out; they just lock. They lock the computer, put it on sleep. I'm done for the day. I wake up, I can pick up where I left off. An aggressive reading of the requirement would say like, hey, if they define this as, within, if you're going to be inactive for an hour, we want you to log out. That can be pretty impactful, right, to user groups who are already very resistant to security. And so there's controls like that where I think like, hey, when we overprescribe it, we're undermining the overall objective of security
And
by
it actually
making it
kind of
so
undermines some
frictionful.
of the other things that we want to be doing in security, right? Like, when do most organizations push software updates, patches? Hopefully not in the middle of the day when you're all trying to do
No.
stuff, right?
And
So
remote workforce, a lot of people turn everything off after hours, which drives the IT administration team crazy.
I know that we push patches and updates in off hours intentionally because to minimize the
Yeah.
disruption. And in order for that to happen, we do
Yeah.
have to, remain somewhat connected. So again, let's not let semantics be the enemy of what was the intent here. You probably should log out from time to time, definitely, but let's make sure that those ODPs like that are well defined and there is kind of a rationale for why that type of ODP was selected or that value of an ODP was
Yeah.
selected.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And you mentioned another thing that like a great guidepost for the implementers, take the user choice out of things as much as you can, right? Or the user dependence. Like don't tell them the policy is, hey, after 30 minutes, log out. If that's gonna be your policy, configure the system to log them out if that's what your policy is gonna be.
Make it easy.
All right, let's talk about 3.1.12.
All
And if you
right.
need me to
Yeah, you gotta.
tell you what that
Okay,
is, that's about
I
remote
do not
access.
know them by heart.
Yeah, you got the control families. I don't expect you to know all the requirements. So 3.1.12 talks about remote access. And one of the debates that has happened over the last 2 years that I've seen is whether or not something like an organization's cloud services like Microsoft 365, if logging into that constitutes remote access. I think Rev 3 makes it a bit stronger case that that is remote access, where Rev 2 is a little more ambiguous. Is that a correct reading?
I think so. And I also think that, let's keep in mind remote access has been a control in 853 since way earlier iterations. And if we think how the technology stack, how organizations implement their systems, or we move from on-prem to a mostly cloud-based infrastructure, the concept of remote access and what is remote, right, is has really drastically changed. How we use the internet has changed a lot. So in this case, you could consider logging into, say, O365 remote access because you are, going through the internet. I think in the discussion, it describes what remote access is, anything that kind of transverses the internet. But the better question is, rather than just focusing on this concept of remote access, aren't you doing these things anyways for everything within this boundary of the system? Aren't you doing this for stuff that's physically here, or making sure that your cloud service provider is also doing that the same set of requirements over there? So like it almost doesn't matter what you call it. Like you should be doing these things anyways, regardless of where it is.
Yeah. So I can tell you our experience on this requirement has been like we've had assessors say like, no, Microsoft 365 is not remote access because it's inside your system architecture. It's like part of your system description. But then I've had others say like it absolutely is. The way we've said is like, well, it's architected to meet the requirements. Like it talks about a managed access control point. Yeah, we have that, regardless of what system you're logging into.
Right.
All of our access
You,
control goes
you're
through a single
doing
point.
usage restrictions, you have some like configuration stuff. Either way, you're doing these things anyways, right? So is it part of the system? Is it?
Again, like you said, don't miss the intent for like the specific wording. Like it's a reasonable, both sort of positions seem reasonable, but it's about like what are
Are
we
you
asking
achieving
you
that
to
outcome?
do?
Are you achieving
Yeah.
that outcome within the control rather than meeting some of the control names or the requirement names?
Yeah. All right. I've got a couple more in 3.1 in
All right,
access
go.
control, which of course is our big control family. 3.1.18. This isn't a question. This is kudos. Thank you for establishing that container-based encryption is a viable way to protect the confidentiality of CUI on mobile devices explicitly. That's a key enabler. We haven't had a whole lot of trouble in the last several years, but early on, we really struggled with BYOD mobile devices and allowing CUI in these container-based encrypted bubbles, essentially. And I think that's just a very wise consideration for the fact that CUI, it's not classified data, but also like this is a modern security architecture. The amount of friction that organizations were having being like, here's your company iPhone. So you would check your email. It's a great way for people to never check their email, right? And now you make it more accessible and acceptable, and using modern tech is just like, thank you. That's all.
We use container-based encryption, but we don't use our personal devices. But yes, we use that as well.
All right. On like a work, so you have like a work device and a container, like doubling up. Let's go.
Double the fun.
All right. Well, hopefully I haven't misinterpreted, but the way I read that was like, hey, that's absolutely, the carve out for the device having a container that's encrypted protects that data from the device itself. That's the design.
For you, we use our federally issued devices and have a container in it. But
you work for the federal government. It's painful. I get it. All right, 3120.
We drink our own champagne, Andy. We drink our own champagne.
That's a way more elegant way of how I always phrase it. I always say we eat our own dog food,
I'm just classier than you.
That's I will say that's not a high bar to be more classy than me. I don't set that bar particularly high, but sure, 100%. The plants behind me make me seem more refined than maybe I am in reality. 3120 talks about the use of external systems, and this kind of ties back to remote access. The example I bring up here again is things like SaaS tools, like Microsoft 365. If it's part of the system, it's external to us in that Microsoft hosts it, but it's internal to us in that it's a key part of our system. It's where the data is going. It's where a lot of our security tooling exists. I've seen wild interpretations around what is an external system, where people have said like an external system is the entire internet. Therefore, we need to prohibit the use of the entire internet unless specifically authorized. So you have people making cases like we should only list the specific websites that are, business essential. You see some stuff like this. What's your take on what an external system is? Like in my example, would Microsoft 365, the way we describe it, be an external system?
And I think we're going to have to go back to let's be reasonable. I actually do think this is one of the ones that DOW, at the time DOD, put out an FAQ. They have a DFARS FAQ that really kind of talks about what they would consider an external system or not. But I think in the discussion of 171, we try to explain the context of external system. Like, do you not have direct supervision or control? So like they would be like personally owned devices, things like that. Realistically, a deny list for the internet seems like it would be I don't know if that juice is worth the squeeze for CUI.
No, it's deeply impractical.
Now, like I'm not talking about classified systems or stuff like that, but for CUI in a non-federal entity, that just seems impossible to do. And I don't know if it's worth it. So, I mean, would I consider like O365 an external system? Not necessarily, because if you were doing business with them, you have some kind of contractual agreement with them. There are some kinds of security requirements that you should be aware of that you require of them, especially if you're using it for, storing, processing, transmitting CUI. So yes, it's external to you, right? It's not within your explicit control, but you also do have that contractual agreement with them. You know what security requirements they have in place. In this example, I can only imagine that O365 is, FedRAMP moderate, or the artist formerly known as FedRAMP moderate, so is meeting a set of comparable security requirements or controls. So are we achieving the intent? Are we protecting the information per the scope of 171? I know, I don't know if that's a level of detail.
That's exactly my read on it. That is, and I think again, it's informing people if they're paying attention and listening to the way you're phrasing it. I think you're answering pretty clearly, which is like, guys, you stop trying to distill this down to zeros and ones. It can't be. There are shades here, and the intent here is like, hey, when you don't have control over an external system, you're going to put data in that. You need to establish the security of that system. You need to have an agreement
You need
with
to know
who's on
what's
the
going
other
on
side of how. Right,
because
and you have
ultimately
that with
you
something like a
or your
commercial
prime
tool
is
like
responsible.
Microsoft.
Yeah, I mean,
Exactly. So fighting over the semantics doesn't achieve the outcome. It's like, hey, what is the requirement actually telling you? Can you answer for that? Great. You can answer for that for M365, especially if you're on the FedRAMP versions. You have a shared responsibility matrix. You have it so tight of who's doing what and how things are meant to be done. So perfect. All right, now let me set you up for a softball because we talked about this before we start recording a little bit, which is 3.122, publicly accessible content. Um, the prevailing question I've been asked in assessments when 3.122 comes up in publicly accessible systems, we get asked about social media. We get asked who posts to social media, who has access to the company LinkedIn. Is that what we're covering here with 3.122?
that's really not the intent, right? Your organization should probably have a social media policy. When we're looking at this in the
Absolutely
scope
should.
of CUI, it's are you separating the CUI and that information and making sure you're not putting it to making it publicly available because that's kind of against the whole point. So I would say no, social media is not really what we consider a publicly accessible system. I think in the context, it's like, you know, is your company website, is that tied back to the system that's processing CUI? Is that information somehow accidentally getting onto your company website accidentally? I think that's a very simple but like obvious use case of what we're trying to protect.
Yeah, what I talk about sometimes is like you might have like a file sharing service that you use for, your clients can access it. Or maybe you have like a service status portal or something that's getting live data from a system you're providing that's, the public can get to. In, it's not internet accessible content. It's public accessible content. Do I have the correct read of that?
I think that, yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it.
Cool. All right. So you nailed it. Yeah,
All
so
right,
far
easy peasy.
you're so far hey, I've got you on my side. This is great. Let's see if I can ask you anything that's
Don't
gonna
ask a
make
FIPS
us
question. We're not
divert.
talking about FIPS then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I'm just softballing to warm you up for the FIPS one because I got a bone to pick there, but we won't do too much there. Um, I skipped ahead. 3.2 security training, especially in Rev 3, it just makes sense, right? It talks about make sure people, if you're going to assign them a role to achieve an information security outcome, you're providing some level of training commensurate with what you're asking them to do. I think that's super straightforward. I have not run into a whole lot of issues with questions around training. Um, Similarly, audit and accountability has been fairly straightforward in our experience. We just don't see a lot of, yeah, there's not a lot of debate there. It's fairly straightforward. Where I have seen some debate, it has a lot more to do with what's reasonable and sufficient. You've seen companies, organizations that are like, hey, we review our logs once a quarter. And, you can read that and be like, I mean, technically it's an ODP. Technically you could do that. It doesn't feel like I can make a good assurance case that you're meeting the outcome for your 1,000-person company that only once a quarter. Now, maybe if you're the one person and you're doing it alone, maybe I could see that. But uh, other than that, which I assume you would think my approach there is reasonable, right? Like an assurance case, a quarterly audit log's probably not.
I think it depends which audit log, right? Like some audit logs you might not need to review as frequently. Others, I would think you would be looking at all the time. But that's just me.
Yeah, yeah. So other than that, other than some people push the envelope outside of reason, I just haven't seen a lot of debate in 3.3.3. So my next one that I wanted to kind of ask about was 3.4.1 and baselines. And this kind of goes back to the question of the system, right? So a current baseline configuration, the requirement for 3.4.1 now is develop and maintain under configuration control a current baseline configuration of the system. Uh, this is another one where I suspect I know your answer, which is like, don't lose the forest for the trees. But I've seen people interpret this to mean like every component must be fully baselined, every configuration that you're going to apply to each component, whether it's a Windows computer, whether it's a specific service that you're using from Microsoft. Uh, Thankfully, I haven't seen that be the prevailing opinion. I think most people have said like, hey, where are the main things happening? Like the person's work computer, totally. You want to know what user computers should have on them. You want to know the core services, but um, the printer, do we need to have a baseline that's like super tight to that? Does my question make sense there? Again, like this ambiguous the system and where there's some ambiguity.
So I think again, it's all about what's the point of this? Like, if when and if something goes wrong, how do you know what was still good? How do you know what was tested and what was implemented and what was working well? How do you get back to that good, right? Or how do you know that something is going wrong because you have deviated so far from that good? You're not within a range of even moderately acceptable. So that's kind of the whole point of configuration change control, right? Um, not, yeah, sure, I need to know exactly what drivers are on my printer. Yeah, but maybe I don't for confidentiality of the system. So let's focus on what are the critical things that are actually important for protecting the CUI. I do like my printer to work on the rare occasion I print.
Yeah, and it goes again. It's like we've had debates where it's like, hey, we need to know what the specific firmware that we're going to run, because in Rev 2 it actually says like in the baseline, it's
Hardware, software,
applications
firmware.
configured. Right. And so we've had the debate where people are like, we want to know like the BIOS firmware of the Windows laptop you're running. And we've said like that, we keep it within a certain like number of generations, but Windows Update at this point applies firmware updates for Dell and major manufacturers. It's so impractical for us to try to like baseline that and control for that and say like, hey, yeah, we're not going to update firmware until we go through our lengthy baseline configuration update process and all that sort of thing. So we've generally found people are reasonable about that, but you can see where people will draw these out to the most strict reading that all practicality just goes out the window.
Honestly, at that point, are you getting any additional security or assurance, or are you just creating a paperwork exercise for yourself?
You're creating an exercise, 100%. All right, I love the way you approach that. 348, this talks, so 348 is a big change from Rev 2, and this is about authorized software allowed by exception.
Okay.
In the current Rev 2, it's, hey, it uses the term whitelist or blacklist or allow list or block list.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the option. Now in Rev 3, it's a deny all, allow by exception. The discussion does say, hey, that can be procedural or it can be technical, but you're being fairly clear at this point. It's not a list of things that are bad. It's a list of things that are good, and only those can execute. Can you speak to the change there and what drove that and sort of like where you see the depth of that?
I mean, I think this does drive back to a change in 853. One of the major things that we did in Rev 3 was for that tighter coupling. If I'm recalling correctly, and I'm probably not at this point, but who knows, when we created 171 Rev 2 and Rev 1, because that's when those requirements really came to fruition, that we ended up merging multiple 853 controls to achieve a single 171 original Rev 1, Rev 2 outcome. So I think when we bifurcated that and split it back out and brought it back to the source control in 53, we ended up going to that level of granularity. So I think it's just making sure that kind of taking away some of that individual control from the end user on the system that stores, processes, transmits CUI. So to kind of really lock down what the end user can do on their own. If I'm remembering the source control correctly, it's really
Yeah,
kind of implementing a least privilege like lens on this.
yeah, and the discussion clears some things up. Like again, it talks about that this can be procedural, it can be technical, which I think was a good distinction, because a lot of what we do today in our implementation of Rev 2 is we do a lot of procedural allow listing. We do have a a technical block list. Um, Shifting toward technical allow lists, especially at like the end user component level, that's just a big undertaking for industry. Going to a software allow list is like painful, especially in some of these DIB environments where it's like a lot of development. So you have to have we have to have a practical way to achieve the intended outcome, which is like, hey, we don't want everyone to just install DeepSeek on their computers sight unseen, right? We want
Not
some
the best
control
idea
there.
if you're,
Right.
dealing with DIB, CUI, but sure, cool.
Yeah, it could go poorly for you. Or hey, maybe in, depending on how things go,
Yeah,
Claude,
I think I'm
right?
gonna say I don't recommend that. I'm gonna go that far.
Yes, I would probably go that far as well. OpenClaw, let's leave that off of the work computers in general, everybody. Probably not your home computer either. But again, goes through the intent, and this is where, uh, uh, at least in Rev 3, this is a shift. It is saying like, hey, it's no longer acceptable to just say, hey, we have a list of some stuff we block. No, we do want you to have a list of things that you allow, whether you do it by procedure or by technical, that's for you to decide commensurate with probably the risk in those systems. But we do want you to deny everything else other than what you're saying is allowed. Cool. All right. So I got a
I
good
think
read
in
on
this
that.
environment, in this case, it does make sense, right? And I don't know if it necessarily needs to be like this software or that software. It could be classes of software. It could be there's a lot of ways to implement this that don't become overly burdensome. So it's up to really that organization to find that kind of sweet middle ground. Right?
I dig it. 353, another big update.
Yeah,
353.
MFA all the time,
I
everywhere.
was going to say,
Early
if there's a control number, I know there's two that you must know by heart, 353 and 31311. 353 is now MFA everywhere all the time. Can you tell me about what drove that change?
I mean, I think this is just something that has become a much more commonplace implementation in general. This is kind of recognized as a security best practice that we're seeing a lot of. I think we're also seeing a push for phishing resistant MFA, which may or may not be a spoiler for something that is to come. Not saying, I'm
Huge.
just saying.
Just skip right ahead and let's talk passwordless. If we could really start peddling passwordless, I'm a huge fan of those capabilities. So um, on the passwordless question, here's another thing, slightly off topic, that has been a challenge, and that is when requirements don't apply. This may be more of a DoD issue than a NIST question, but suppose we are fully passwordless. Logic would follow that the password requirements of NIST 800-171 don't apply. Like if we are truly fully adopted into passwordless, they're not used, we should be able to readily say like, hey, we don't use passwords in the organization. The system doesn't use it, doesn't apply. Is that accurate?
I mean, it's kind of like saying you need to protect wireless access if this system has no wireless. I guess I already did because it's not there.
Yeah, good. Yeah, logic
I
would
don't know.
follow,
I don't
right?
know a better analogy.
You would be shocked at the debates that have been had about things that are not applicable and whether or not we're allowed to say they're not applicable.
I should buy motorcycle insurance even though I don't think I'm tall enough to ride a motorcycle.
Just the messenger of the experience that certain interpretations from certain federal institutions have said, hey, you can't mark things NA. So you'll see if you had access to all the SSPs out in the wild, you'd see a lot of things that say they're implemented that aren't actually applicable, but they've been implemented by way of not applying them. It's very backward. But
I feel
anyway,
like that's a semantic issue, but you know what?
it 100% is
Cool.
semantics.
Cool.
So sometimes we do the semantic dance that we have to dance. But 353 is now, hey, MFA everywhere. It's accessible. It's not particularly difficult. A lot of modern operating systems like Windows have ways that you can do that. Windows Hello for Business. If you're not MFAing everything that's internet based already, you are probably already compromised and you don't know it. But hopefully you did accountability and audit, because then you can at least figure
There
out
you
what happened.
go.
All right, we're in the home stretch here. I just have a couple more I want to press you, or I press you about. I'm not pressing you. We're just having casual, fun conversation here.
Yes, this is what
Um,
I talk about at dinner parties. We pull out
I'm
our
sure.
favorite
I'm
security
sure.
requirement.
All right, everybody, open up NIST 800-171. Let's split the hairs here. Really, I only have two more that I had that I really wanted to get into discussion with you on. 312.3 is continuous monitoring. So 312.1 is like, hey, a security assessment. Let's make sure that the controls are effective. The way a lot of that is being met is timed, calendar based, sit down, discussion, look at evidence. Are these things functional? And a lot of times that's a annual process for the average company. 312.3 is, hey, there should also be continuous monitoring. This is another one of those spectrums where I've seen some people have made the case we expect every requirement to be continuously monitored in some capacity, so that security teams should be asking HR with some regularity, hey, can I see that you've recently done the background check on so and so? And then some say, like, hey, there are certain requirements that, yeah, we should probably be continuously monitoring, like MFA didn't get turned off. But we maybe don't need to continuously monitor um, that the Wi-Fi password didn't get removed. What's your take on that?
I mean, my answer to most of these questions is let's use common sense, right? Let's take policy and procedures for example. You should continuously check in that your policies and procedures are relevant, up to date, in place. Most likely, most organizations don't change or drastically change their policy and procedures that often. They're pretty high level, lock the doors, take out the trash, wash your hands when you're done with the bathroom, right? Things like that. Continuously monitoring doesn't mean you need to be checking the pulse every minute, every second. That means you just have some planned ongoing frequency that you touch base on that. I think policy and procedures is generally a great example of something that you should check in on, but it doesn't, I don't know, does it need to be every week? Probably not. Maybe every quarter, maybe every year. The frequency of that continuous monitoring is based on risk. Now, something like flaw remediation, that's something that I would hope that is a far more dynamic implementation of a control, that you are continuously monitoring how that control is being implemented, how it's effective, and is it in place. Especially since as a more technical control, you can use automation, you can use the data from your network to evaluate, is that good or not? So using common sense to kind of identify what you really need to have, almost near real time information versus what you need to know is good and solid and should be still good as long as nothing crazy happens in like a month, is the sweet spot of implementing a strong continuous monitoring ISCM strategy. NIST actually has an entire publication on information security continuous monitoring, 800-137. We have 137A, which provides guidance on how you set up an information security monitoring program. So everything from that governance to how you apply that organization-wide continuous monitoring to each system. Because again, based on the mission, based on the information, based on its relative importance, a lot of those variables are going to change. And they should, because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
I hope people that watch this are just like constantly, every time you say something, they're just like, oh, because it's music to my ears.
It's, I
Right?
gotta
Like,
read something else.
well, sometimes it is like, hey, NIST, yeah, do you have a publication about that? Seems like
Yes,
you have a
yes, I
publication
do.
about everything. Yeah, 100%. All right, so now the last one that I'm going to ask, and then I'll open the floor for you to make some points. The last one's, of course, going to be 313.11. Rev 3 does at least make this an ODP and say, like, hey, if you're going to use cryptography, use this type ODP. But the discussion does say, like, hey, FIPS validated crypto is what we recommend for CUI. And the DoD in their initial output of ODPs said, like, hey, we're staying with the FIPS validated crypto. If I could just soapbox for 30 seconds, I am truly interested in what the intent and what the risk mitigation calculus goes into making that recommendation. But from my soapbox, I promise you, I will bet a lot of money that the DoD's RFI that they put out about CMMC, the questions are like, hey, which controls have really been a thorn in your side? The number one answer, bar none, is going to be 313.11. You could poll anybody in the DIB today, and I think 90% or more are going to say the FIPS validated cryptography has caused us more pain and struggle. Because the way we understand it is that we have to use the FIPS validated modules themselves. Not, the example I would use is There's a tool that uses OpenSSL3. OpenSSL3 is FIPS validated, but that tool's implementation of it is not, so I can't use it. I can only use a tool that's using a module that together has been validated, which is a huge, huge limiter in what we're able to do. Let's talk about that. Is that the intent? And tell me what drives that, because it is the most friction in the whole program, in my estimation.
I think we hear feedback and thoughts on kind of FIPS and FIPS validated cryptography, not just from the DIB. So don't worry, you have plenty of friends in that same camp. I think, to be very candid, our FIPS validation program has had its challenges. There are procedural and administrative burdens that take time. And to have both the validated module and there are challenges in ensuring that we are able, organizations using and trying to meet this requirement or control are also able to access the latest and greatest technology. Not to speak on behalf of a different research program in my division, but there have been and continue to be programmatic and structural changes to how we run that program to make it make more sense, right? The end goal here is to provide good security and assurance that the cryptography being used in each implementation is secure and protecting the information, the system, the mission, yada yada. But there is also a trade-off between something that has been fully tested and vetted versus something that is new. Because what's fully tested and vetted is old and things will change. One configuration change could plausibly invalidate that validation. So looking at that from a more pragmatic perspective of, is this something completely new versus is this a small delta and what that impact is? There are ongoing changes to our CMVP, our crypto module validation program, to be more adaptive and responsive to the current needs, to get through that backlog in a kind of a more expedited way. So I think more to come on how NIST evolves the larger program behind FIPS. But the whole reasoning for that ODP, and if just again, inside baseball, is we got a lot of heat in the original 171, Rev 1, Rev 2, about explicitly saying FIPS validated. Creating that into an ODP does allow the federal agency the right of refusal on how they want to address it. In the previously released ODPs from DOW, they have elected to use FIPS validated crypto. Again, it is their prerogative to evolve that to meet market needs, their risk tolerance, because at the end of the day, it's not my CUI, it's not NIST CUI. That's, unless NIST is issuing a contract, but that's a different, but in this context, this is DOW's risk decision on what is acceptable risk.
So yeah, not to belabor the point, because I think you've probably heard a number of the challenges here, but this one bites at me in particular. If you want to use Linux in a CUI environment, you have to be like 15 kernel versions behind to use, one of the FIPS validated like Ubuntu versions or whatever. And there's so much performance improvement, especially in like some of the emerging technology, like AI usage. So we're trying to develop some local AI type stuff running on Linux. We can't do it because the performance is so poor, so we're not able to use Linux to do it. So like, hey, we have to look more at the commercial things, and we would love, for security's sake, to be able to locally host all the capabilities that we want. But we're actively having to make what I think is probably a less secure overall choice to use a different platform because of that. And so that's another example of the challenge. But I'm interested in the calculus, if you can speak to it, and why the recommendation from NIST is FIPS validated cryptography. If I understand it correctly, you are essentially saying the only cryptography that we can really trust to protect CUI as a data type is cryptography that we ourselves have had a chance to validate as NIST.
So NIST has a very, the CMVP, the Crypto Module Validation Program, has a pretty complex ecosystem where NIST has a role, the independent labs have a role, we have a partnership with Canada. So it's not just NIST evaluating. NIST kind of runs that process. We use independent accredited third-party labs that do that testing and that validation. So, I mean, it already sounds complicated when I'm just describing it, and we haven't even.
I know, and
Like,
I know I'm being overly simplistic, but essentially, like, is the calculus, hey, we hear you, like, we understand that, AES 256, whatever, all that exists, and we understand that you can make a case that stuff is secure, but we're not comfortable with the risk that it would pose to CUI as a data type to be encrypted by something that has not been validated through this process. That has to have been the calculus, right?
originally, and I think, given some of the feedback from true real world implementation, right, this is why, not just for CUI, not just for 171, the whole CMVP process and how we're working it, how we're getting things through the validation have been evaluated. There have been process improvements. There have been different ways that we are trying to expedite and almost, I don't want to say carve out because that sounds, wrong, but provide avenues that
Yeah.
allow for leveraging kind of updates to technology within reason that are based on trusted, validated modules. So we're trying to find that middle ground of let's try to modernize, but also we need to make sure that there is some security. You don't want, homespun, garage built, and who knows where crypto modules.
Yeah.
But let's find
Yeah, we
that.
can't be like, hey, just SHA-1 is encryption. Well, yeah,
It is.
it's beatable. But
Technically it is.
yeah, I'm with you. I understand that. All right, so I've sufficiently beat you up. I said my piece. I've said it. We have a couple minutes left, and this is where I'm interested. What I've been asking, what can you do for us? What clarity can you provide us? What can industry, what can the federal ecosystem, especially in the contracting base, what can we do for NIST? What can we do to get you feedback in the format that you need, get you information that helps you all in your work? How do we support you all?
Well, your dog feels really strongly, and I know he's going to participate. So I'm looking forward to that. Honestly,
They always have to get a word in.
853, we've developed an online comment tool. You can submit comments to NIST anytime, anywhere from the website. So you don't have to wait for a public comment period. And I know it's weird that I'm bringing up 853 when we're talking about 171, but every single requirement from 171 and 172 as well is derived from 853. So if you want to see a change in 171, we will make it in 53 first and let it flow down. This way, it's not an unequal set of requirements for protecting CUI for the non-federal entity and the federal agencies as well. The whole long-term goal of 171 is to really be tightly coupled with 53, focused on confidentiality. So if you have questions, comments, feedback on 53, you can provide those comments, those ideas, those gaps to NIST real time, online. You don't have to read the whole thing. You can engage in our public comment processes. You can submit feedback 24/7. You can always reach out to me or my team, and we are happy to have those conversations, because really understanding some of the challenges in implementation and the ecosystem, while they may or may not be something that NIST can solve, I think adds a lot of value even if NIST kind of understands that perspective, so we can try to do what we can within our sphere of influence to make sure we're getting the right security objectives. We're meeting those security outcomes in a reasonable way. I think the whole key thing is let's be reasonable, people.
And that's the quote, right? That's the subtitle to this video. Like, let's be reasonable.
Let's be reasonable.
Well, Vicky, you've been exceptionally generous with your time. We booked you for not as much time as we ended up using. So I really appreciate it. I think everyone that will watch it will appreciate it. Again. This was the perspective I got after we filmed our Watchers episode, which is like, man, if people knew who was over at NIST, what their perspectives are, what their mission is, how their mission focused, how their intent focused, how reasonable they are, we would avoid so much of the debate and some of the minutiae we get into. Like, I love that we have access to the source, right? And I love how approachable you've been in the last several years. So greatly appreciate your time with us, greatly appreciate you interacting with industry the way you do. And I'll give you last word before we wrap up. Anything else you want to end on?
I mean, thank you for having me. I always appreciate the opportunity to reach out to the community. We want to hear at NIST. We really want to hear from you. The success, the value, the benefit add of our resources does depend a lot on the stakeholders participating. So, like, yeah, smart people work here, yada yada, but lots of smart people work on the outside, and we rely on you just as much to help raise all boats because we only see what we can see. You have eyes and ears in places that we don't. You are the boots on the ground that have to drink this champagne. So we want to hear feedback on the vintage. Let's make the next one better.
Sounds so celebratory. I love it. All right. Well, Vicky, thank you so much again for coming on. It was a lot of fun, and we'll do it again next time. Talk more about FIPS.